When we talk about the environment, I think all we really hear is a lot of alarmism. And I think you do a good job of discussing the alarmism. Why do you think this is the case? And do you think this is a fair approach to the dialogue of the environment?
Yeah, I mean, we can look at the past and we can see that environmentalism wasn't always about alarmism.
Sure.
And I was actually at an event in Washington a couple of years ago where I asked a crowd of mostly 65 plus year olds
Sure.
if they considered themselves an environmentalist in the 1980s, and every single person in that crowd raised their hand. And when I asked them if they considered themselves an environmentalist today, no one raised their hand.
Sure.
Because the term and the topic has become so polarizing and alarmist. And I attribute that to Al Gore mostly, because in the early 2000s,
You're talking about not the internet. You're talking about environmentalism.
Yeah, I mean, Al Gore also did some stuff with the internet, I hear. I think he invented it. Yeah. But the environment, he turned into a political issue that he wanted to win on.
Sure.
And so instead of equating the environment to the environment, people in America started equating the environment to the Democratic Party.
Sure.
And now you have this world where it's like alarmism and trying to win an election off of saying that basically the world's going to end and instilling this fear reaction.
Okay.
And then the right saying, well, there's actually no problem at all and we don't need to do anything about it. So you have this like horrible divide. I have a dream that someday the environment could be about the environment again, and that environmentalism is about finding ways to make people's lives better and the environment being protected at the same time.
Sure.
And that's the future that I think we can and should pursue.
Sure. So I'm gonna use this. You talked about this a couple spots in the book, but I just want to use this as a way of thinking about policy. Mm-hmm. You discuss corn. Mm-hmm. Okay. And I think this is an interesting way to think about the evolution of the politics and policy interacting with each other to get what may or may not be good outcomes. So can you, as we think about like ethanol in our gasoline, can you teach our listeners how did this come about? In other words, to your point about in the 80s, we weren't using corn in gasoline. So how did this come about? And then has that helped the environment or not?
Yeah, I think it's a great example of a broader problem, which is that a lot of times the government or the private sector, but the government's really bad at it, invests in something that they think is going to be part of the solution. And then eventually they find out that it's not going to be a good solution, and they just keep sticking with it because they're too lazy or too afraid to admit that they're wrong.
Sure.
And I think ethanol is a perfect example. In the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, ethanol became an increasing part of the conversation because basically you were allowing farmers in the Midwest to grow more corn, to get extra income for their families, to support these communities. And oh, by the way, you're using a natural resource to partially fuel our vehicles.
Sure.
It sounds really good. It's kind of like, why not use the sun to power our homes with solar panels? Like, why not use corn to power our cars if it works?
Sure.
And so it sounds really good. But what ended up happening was we started overproducing corn for something that wasn't actually, it was kind of a thing where it's like, it's inefficient now, but it's going to get better. We're going to be able to use corn as the complete fuel. Just wait, the cost will come down, the efficiency will go up.
Kind of like a Back to the Future, throw your garbage in your car.
Exactly.
And we'll use the biodegradable form.
Exactly. We'll figure it out. Right now it's expensive, right now it's inefficient, but we're going to figure it out. Well, it was never figured out. It hasn't been cost effective, it hasn't been efficient, and the technology never really advanced.
Sure.
So then we're growing all this excess corn for something that's actually not working on its own from an economic standpoint. And we're draining the Midwest of its water supply in the process, because growing corn for all of our vehicles is a lot of water. And in states like Nebraska, literally the elevation of the state is sinking because they've drained so much of the water supply below their feet.
Wow.
And so in a world of everything's a trade-off. Every single solution environmentally and every single solution in our lives is a trade-off. The trade-off is just not working with ethanol, and we have been too afraid to admit it.
Sure. Well, and we're going to come back to this idea, but I think Newton's third law is for every action, there's an equal and an opposite reaction. And we think a lot about that as investors.
He was a pretty smart guy.
You have to think about that.
Yep.
And so we'll come back to that because you point out something else with physics that I like. But so let's bring this back. You and I have lived in Washington. So I think a lot of this, like you did in your book, is a good picture. Western Washington versus Eastern Washington. Yeah. Okay. And this is a lot similar to, most people don't know this, but California, at one point prior to Pearl Harbor, they were thinking about dividing Northern California versus Southern California. Northern California was going to be called the state of Jefferson. I don't know if you know that.
I didn't know that.
That'd be you'll still see them up in like Wairika. It'll be like state of Jefferson bumper
That would have been canceled by now.
That would have been. Well, it was very un-American post Pearl Harbor, right? But I just say that because this is not unique to Washington. Right. This is very common. You have the urban versus, in effect, the ex-urb or rural areas.
Yep.
So talk about the educational divide too, because there's like stereotypes that go with this. It's like, the rednecks out in Eastern Washington, that hate the environment and things like that. That's what you'd hear in Seattle. So can you talk about that divide?
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a city, small town, I guess, for most people's thought processes in Wisconsin, where my high school is across the street from a dairy farm.
Sure.
So I grew up in rural America, and I thankfully was at kind of a suburban rural crossroads, but I got to see it firsthand. And I had such respect for rural communities growing up because I knew that they were the ones putting the food on our tables. I knew that they were the ones providing the energy for our homes. And even though some days I woke up and I smelled cow manure outside my window, that there was a reason for that.
Sure.
And that somehow those trade-offs are happening, and they're benefiting us in some ways and they're hurting us in others, but that these communities are the lifeblood of a lot of our lives. So when I moved to Seattle, and then I saw the urban elitism of people there, and the just the disrespect that they showed towards other Washingtonians who were, again, feeding their lives, powering their lives, and actually doing the quote-unquote dirty work for these people who are basically just poo-pooing everything that they do, I was like really dismayed. And I started to realize when I saw that that's really what a lot of America's problems boil down to be honest. But specifically around the environment, rural areas don't understand what urban challenges are when it comes to environmental issues. Mm-hmm. But more importantly, I think urban areas don't understand what rural areas are dealing with. And so when you have, and my dad was one of the first people to read through the whole book because he got an early copy, but like, he was like, wow, you hammered on Jay Inslee, the Washington governor, more than almost anyone in the book.
That was my favorite part of the book.
And I'm like, well, it's true. He's a perfect example of what's wrong with this conversation. You have somebody who's never cared or even pretended to care about rural America telling rural America what to do. And yet those are the people who have the biggest stake in the environment's success. When you're living in a skyscraper in downtown Seattle, which no one's doing now because it's a total crapshoot down there, but like if hypothetically someone wanted to live in a skyscraper in downtown Seattle in that hypothetical situation, they do not have a personal stake in the environment like someone who is living off the land and literally creating a crop for us to survive as a species from. So to have someone like Jay Inslee, who's probably never spent time in a field in his life, telling people who spend all day in a field how to live their lives, it's very disingenuous. And I think that that's where a lot of the problems on environmentalism come from. If you look at the biggest leaders, it's AOC, Bernie Sanders, Greta Thunberg, it's Al Gore. They're some of the most urban people in the entire world. They've never been to nature. I'm not even sure if they've ever been to a national park. So they don't know how to take care of the land, and yet they're telling people how to live their lives, and it's very, very hard to grapple with.
The irony of what you're saying is I think Inslee's originally from Yakima, which is a very rural place. It's kind of, I think it's the Palm Springs of Washington.
Right.
It's a fruit basket in effect, which is the irony. So I want to show.
And now he doesn't care about their priorities at all.
Yeah.